The beginning of the 20th century in Britain, indeed in the whole of Europe, is often seen by historians as a turning point. Britain's industrial advantage starts to decline, for example.
And there were lots of overseas threats. There was the Boer War in Africa, riots in China, the Boxer Rebellion took place in China. And the whole place worldwide was in a bit of turmoil.
There is a sense that there are a lot of social problems. We've got somewhat of a divide opening up in the church, which are really both trying to answer the same question: how do we respond to the rise of mass democracy, mass society, leisure, science, the modern world? On the one hand, those saying retreat and retrench, and on the others, those saying engage and modify.
And there was obviously, as is always, a spin-off in Scotland. Fishing remained a very important part of the Scottish economy, and in the year 1900 they brought in more than 1 million barrels of fish. 80% of the Scottish fishing fleet existed in the northeast of Scotland, round the coast from, let's say, Aberdeen right up to Wick.
Jock Troup was born in 1896. His father was a railway signalman.
The first 6 years of his life were spent in Fraserburgh, a lovely Highland village. Moved when he was about 6 or 7 to Wick. His parents were both godly people, his mother especially, a deeply spiritual woman. He was a boy full of fun, full of activity and energy. He was a leader from childhood. At that time, Wick Harbour was absolutely end-to-end with fishing boats, and the boys had endless fun round about the harbour. The whole of the fibre of life on shore was dependent on what was going out in the sea. For every ship, every boat that was out fishing, there'd be 100 jobs linked to that boat, because they were exporting to Russia and Finland, Holland and Germany, and packing the barrels for export there. Spiritually, it was very busy, very active. Instead of singing O Day of Rest and Gladness on a Sunday, they were liable to be singing O Day of Zest and Madness, because the whole place was like a flourishing production line on a Sunday, with prayer meetings and Sunday schools and afternoon spiritual tonic services and open air meetings, all sorts of things going on, especially on a Sunday, but quite a lot of activity through the week as well. Even although the fishermen were away from midnight on Sunday, they weren't allowed to sail before midnight on Sunday. They were away from midnight on Sunday.
They would come down and they would, what we say, red on the nets, take the nets from the side deck into the middle of the boat, ready to shoot at night. He would shoot his nets away maybe from 7 o'clock till 9 o'clock at night. Now, at that time, they maybe have about 70 nets, which was, we'll say, anything from half a mile long, just lying drifting at night, hanging in the water just like a large curtain. And herring, being a pelagic fish, they come off the bottom at night to feed in the plankton, and that's when they used to gill themselves. They just stuck their head into the mesh, and the boats started maybe hauling at 1 o'clock in the morning. But the majority of the fish finished up, salted and gutted, and then it was packed into barrels.
Jock was a cooper in the fishing industry. That was his trade. The barrels for exporting the fish and packing the fish were tied by government regulation, and so they had to be very careful, and so it was a skilled 4-year apprenticeship.
He had a very important job. The cooper made the barrels. At the turn of the century, they were making about 4 barrels every day, working 6 days a week, so that was 24 barrels. And he would start off with this plain piece of wood called a stave, and he would work on it. It had been soaked in water, and then he shaped it and curved it, curved the barrel. If there was a small curer with maybe just 2 or 3 crews of gutting women, he would have 1 cooper, and that cooper had to help in the yard. The cooper had to call out the gutting women, and he would tell them to, come on girls, get your clooties on. Now that was the bandages they had to put on their fingers to protect them from the sharp knife. When the gutted herrings was taken to the packer, and when she packed her first tier of herring, she would shout bottom, and he would have to come and check
and the cooper always was checking it was right packed, because if it didn't pass the Crown brand, as I said, the inspector came from the government. If he took off a lid of the barrel and it wasn't up to scratch, he wouldn't stamp it, so they couldn't export that fish.
The First World War broke out. Jock joined the Royal Navy Patrol Service, which was operating out of Dublin, just south of Dublin.
And he had a friend there who was invited to the Dublin YMCA, and Mr. and Mrs. West, who were heading up the work there at that time, invited the two lads home for tea.
And he seemed to really warm to their Christian story, their Christian hospitality, and that was the beginning of his kind of spiritual journey. In his own testimony and words, he tells us that he had an evangelical conversion, a moment of realization that he was a sinner, that he needed Christ's forgiveness for his sin. He immediately wanted to tell people. He went back on board the ship and kind of shared people and told them they needed to stop their card playing and their swearing and their gambling and so on. And I think it wasn't easy for him. I think his testimony shows there were some struggles there. The First World War, psychologically, it's catastrophic to Europe, to Britain, to that optimism.
And the effect of trench warfare absolutely destroyed the morale of the men who came home after the war. Large numbers of them were never seen in church again. They came back disillusioned, a lot of them. Jock came home after the war had finished, after his demob.
Jock joined the regular migration of the Scottish fishermen down to East Anglia.
When you were involved as a cooper in the fishing industry, you had to follow the silver darlings down the east coast, starting in Shetland in the spring and finishing up in East Anglia in Lowestoft and Yarmouth by the beginning of October. And so he was travelling down and he went to a fisherman's mission in Aberdeen at 200 Market Street. And Jock had been listening to what could be called nowadays the Keswick message of a deeper work of holiness. And he was very convicted when he heard the preacher that night in the fisherman's mission. And it seems as if that God came into his life in a special way, and he had to get out of the meeting. His heart was pounding, and he thought actually his heart was going to break. And so he escaped from the meeting and went up a tenement close.
It's very clear that he had a special experience with the Holy Spirit in Aberdeen outside of the fisherman's mission. And he talks in a way that the presence of God was so strong he had to ask God to stay that presence. And that was a very important experience for him in really having complete confidence in his call and in the message that God had given him. I think it's important though to say that I don't think that was something that he preached that was everyone had to have in order to be used by the Lord.
The weather was absolutely foul in 1920-21, and it was the lowest catch ever for them. They were totally dispirited when they got down to East Anglia.
They arrived there in the middle of a revival movement that was already happening. What had happened is churches of Lowestoft had invited a man called Douglas Brown to come and lead a mission, an interdenominational mission in the town's churches. Douglas Brown was a Baptist minister from Balham in South London. He had enormous success in Balham. He himself had an experience quite like Jock's, where he'd had a moment of what he called surrender to God, where God, he believed, was calling him to go outside of his church and become a missionary. Shortly afterwards, he arrived in Lowestoft in the beginning of 1921. So Douglas Brown had been leading meetings throughout the week in the churches of Lowestoft, and there had been an enormous reaction to this. Lots of people coming in, lots of people hearing it. News about the Lowestoft revival, as it was called, began being reported in the Christian press, and people became very interested in what was going on. Douglas Brown himself preached quite a lot about the second coming of Christ, so that there was that theme of expectation of Christ's return as part of his renewal message. He said that what God wants is a church that is fully dedicated to him. His idea of revival was the Christian getting right with God within the church, and then he said the church will become God's agent for the evangelization of the world. The fishermen, therefore, arriving in Lowestoft and East Anglia, came into this scene of religious excitement, and Jock came with them and started preaching out in the marketplace, in the some of the mission halls there in Lowestoft and in some other places in East Anglia.
Jock joined in with Douglas Brown. At one point when they were preaching together, they were standing with their arms round one another in the pulpit, crying like babies as God was blessing the congregation.
What we do know, there was a dramatic sense of God's power and God's presence. Lots of the fishing people who'd come were converted or perhaps renewed. It's sometimes hard to tell, who's who. We don't know about the spiritual background of everyone. What we do know is that revival encompassed both conversion and kind of sanctification, renewal, and that obviously was both going on.
There wasn't much fishing going on, and they're wandering about, particularly at weekends, Saturday nights and stuff like that, where maybe a crowd of up to 1,000 people milling about the harbour area. But Jock, of course, was absolutely in his element in the open air. He had a fantastic voice. Someone once paced out his voice when he was at the Bangor Convention, and the voice could be heard a mile away from where he was speaking without amplification. And on that Saturday night, when God moved in an amazing way, he started preaching on a very unusual text from the prophecy of Isaiah, which visualizes Messiah coming, wading up to the hips in the blood of his enemies. It's really quite a kind of strong stuff. But they said by the time Jock was finished, the place was like a battlefield. There were people lying about all over the place, crying out to God for mercy. And he was moving among them. My imagery is like Florence Nightingale at the Crimea, attending to wounded soldiers, trying to comfort people and encourage them and point them to God. That's what happened on that Saturday night.
The actual moment of revival was not what we might call happy, clappy celebration. It was actually a sense of reverence and fear. People fell prostrate in the fear of God. And, of course, by describing it like a battlefield, there was some sense of alluding perhaps to the context. That imagery was in people's minds of the First World War, that there was a sense that God was to be feared, and this was a God who was ruler and king, and I think that was the spirit of this age, the expectation that Christ was coming back. And so this part of the renewal was dubbed the fisherman's revival.
Because some folk were very reluctant to go out to sea until they'd made their peace with God. And there were some folk bringing fisher lasses and fishermen to Jock and to Douglas and to other workers in the place, that they would give them spiritual counsel, so that they would feel a kind of peace of mind to go out to sea. A number of the boats went home, well filled with people who had had some spiritual experience. And as the boats approached their home port, the singing on the boats was being echoed by the folk on the land, because the news had spread. And so they went right up the coast, spreading the message of how God had been at work among them. Jock sent home his tools and never needed them again, never used them again for the rest of his life. That was him finished being a cooper. And he got a vision of a man in Fraserburgh inviting him to come there to preach.
So when Jock arrived in Fraserburgh, he went straight to Salton Square, the town centre, and began to preach in the open air, just as he would have done in Yarmouth. And a crowd quickly gathered, but unfortunately the rain came on, so people were beginning to get wet, and one person in the crowd suggested that they go to the Baptist church and take the meeting there. So Jock and the crowd went out to the Baptist church and knocked on the door, and they were welcomed in. And little did they know that the deacons had gathered to draft a letter inviting Jock to come to Fraserburgh. And when Jock began to preach there in the Baptist church, the first face he recognised was the man he saw in his vision, who was asking God to send Jock to Fraserburgh.
The revival does spread. Now, to some extent, that's because the fishermen are coming back from the Lowestoft revival and are going back to their individual towns. So there's a kind of network forming, and Jock and some other preachers as well are being invited to these places to encourage the revival flames.
This is from the Scotsman newspaper. And it reported on the 20th of December 1921 about Eyemouth. The little fishing ports of Eyemouth and Bournemouth, the revival wave which is sweeping the ports in the north of Scotland had made itself felt. Today the men have come back from fishing at Lowestoft, which has been a failure. Following upon a period of bad trade, many are on the verge of ruin, and again comes the evidence of religious feeling in the face of disaster. Ministers and lay preachers are assisting the converted orators at the revival meetings being held, and though the language and phrases of the later speakers may be innocent of oratorical merit, their testimony is given with the fierceness of a northeast gale. And it is this evidence which is bearing away hundreds on the revival flood.
My memory of Jock Troup, when it came to prayer, he lay on his back. And I remember it seems it was yesterday. When it come to the prayer time, that was a time, you see, where mothers, they were strict with you see. You had to shut your eyes, you see, to prayer. But that was our chance to have a look around. And I was looking right at Jock Troup, and he was lying right on his back, and looking up this way. His hands up, you see, praying. And I never saw that before, you see. So I wanted to ask my mum. But as just myself, I was afraid. It had my eyes open during the prayer, you see. It had seen us. But it got the better of me, so I asked my mum, oh, she says, I'll take what it was. His knees was that sore, we're praying. He was always on his knees. He couldn't go on his knees. So he wouldn't pray standing up. So he prostrated himself lying, he prayed. And I can see him yet. And it's never left me, Jock Troup praying in his back.
When Jock was in Fraserburgh, he was my age. He was in his early 20s, and God used him in a great way, which is inspirational to many young people, to know that it doesn't matter what age you are. From my research of Jock Troup, one of the key things that inspired me was his passion, and also his simplicity. He was a simple fisherman, but yet was empowered by the Spirit of God, and God used him in great ways, even though he maybe wasn't the deep theologian at this point. My grandfather wasn't the only one who was involved in the revival here. There were people like Cordner and Willie Bruce and others that God was using at the same time, and all of them were men who just gave themselves completely over to God. If you think about it, they were new Christians. They weren't schooled, they hadn't been to seminary, and the Holy Spirit was just working through them because they were men who'd given themselves totally to the empowering of the Holy Spirit.
And the great thing about Jock, with that voice that he had, it was a bit like Jesus in this respect, that he would speak with authority. And that would come over when the visitors came into the meetings. They would see the authority of the preacher and the confirmation of God in the lives of those who heard the message.
Numerous people from the Church of Scotland, the Free Church of Scotland, and journalists travelled to Fraserburgh and some of the other towns to observe what was going on. The general impression was that this is not mass hysteria, that this is some kind of genuine religious revival, religious renewal, and that we ought to support it and encourage it.
Well, one fisherman who was questioned on the revival said this: "You cannot get up a revival, it must come down." In other words, revival comes from God, and so when you're talking about revival, you're talking about God coming down. And there's never been a revival among critics of the Bible. Revival only comes amongst those who humble themselves to believe what the Bible says, and it comes from above. It's a movement downwards from God to man. The turnout was terrific for these meetings. It would start off with quite a lot of enthusiastic singing. It would include testimonies, and people would get up to testify of the change in them since they become converted, and the whole place would kind of catch that flavour.
One of the key aspects to the fisher folk in the North East community is the shared experience. They did lots of things together. They went to work together, they went to church together, they raised their families together. When the revival would have outbroken in Fraserburgh, the whole community would have been affected by what was happening. It would have been impossible for only certain families to have been affected because the shared experience of the fisher folk wouldn't have allowed that.
So Jock's message was very kind of raw message in a way. It wanted people to get connected with God, to know God personally, and for that knowledge of God, that experience of God, to make a difference.
So a lot of the preaching would be centred on what Jesus has done for us on the cross, how he died with arms outstretched, an invitation to us to come to him.
There was certainly some evidence during the revival time that the public houses were less full, that people were not playing cards as much and not gambling as much.
The crime figures altered. Courts didn't have nearly as much to do, and the jails weren't as full as they normally were.
To what extent that stuck long term in those communities is much harder to measure, but certainly at the time that was one thing that people noticed and commented upon. I think it's clear that by late 1922, that initial explosion, as it were, has ended, that there's not that intensity to what's going on. It's no longer observed by people as a phenomena, as an event after that period. Now, that of course doesn't mean that it's not significant for individuals and for communities, and I think what you see is that shapes the experience of the churches in the northeast. The memory is still there today of that revival.
How I came to be interested in Jock Troup was by going on holiday to the northeast, and again and again and again I heard folks saying, my mother came to the Lord through Jock Troup, my granny came to the Lord through Jock Troup.
Today in Fraserburgh there are still many young people whose grandparents or great-grandparents were affected by the events in 1921, and they are active in the community and in the church life of Fraserburgh, and they are serving God still to this day, and themselves have a desire for God to do something new in Fraserburgh now.
Jock realised that he'd got a public platform, that God was using him, and so he better make sure that his Bible knowledge, that his skills, his theology was aligned with what he was actually doing. He enrolled in the Bible Training Institute of Glasgow, which was founded in the 1870s in the wake of the D.L. Moody campaigns.
Because there were so many people got converted when Moody was in Glasgow. And so the BTI started, the Bible Training Institute started exactly for the kind of person Jock Troup was. It started for people with limited education to be trained for Christian work. A lot of them went into what we now call city mission work. D.M. McIntyre, the principal, when he went there, was one of the godliest men and a wonderful scholar, theologian. And he was exactly the kind of guy who would shape Jock Troup and modify him a bit. And he understood Jock. Jock was away all the time, preaching all over the place when he was at the BTI. He didn't fulfil all his Christian commitments in the college because he was one of these guys that was an activist. After
leaving the BTI, Jock was in quite high demand as an itinerant preacher. If you read the evangelical press, they'd often have a whole page spread detailing all of the missionaries, people like Jock, kind of people who would travel around to various gospel halls or mission halls and would run evangelistic rallies. This was a recognised thing for people to do at this time. There was a very strong culture of the travelling preacher. Numerous organisations would coordinate this, and in fact I think in 1928 Jock joined the Kirkcaldy Gospel Union, which was a kind of umbrella group for some itinerant evangelists. Jock's preaching was very lively, dramatic, fling his arms around, his voice would be loud, he'd be sweating profusely, he poured his all into this preaching, and he was a singer. He'd often sing these gospel songs.
Jock was a great singer, you know. He actually made, I think, 29 records for Beltona Records.
I saw in his brow and his sight deeply wounded, and now I love Jesus, and Jesus loves me. Oh, Jesus, my Saviour, will soon be returning for those he redeemed by his blood, will rise in the clouds.
One person who attended these meetings said that his appeals were almost irresistible, and they felt they were compelled to listen to him.
He was, for example, leading meetings in Northern Ireland at the Bangor Missionary Convention. He led great big children's meetings there. The children loved him. The children went away singing from the meetings that he held. He was just an endearing character. I have to say he had his faults, the same as the rest of us. He was impatient. He went to a fish and chip shop queue in Arbroath once, and there was a big queue, and when he got there, he got to the end of the queue and he shouted over to the head of the chip shop, "Excuse me, I'm a preacher of the gospel and I have to preach tonight. Could I possibly get to the front of the queue to get my fish and chips?" And the guy let him have his fish and chips. He married a girl called Katie Black from Wick.
Glasgow in the 1930s was an industrial town, and yet right from the 19th century and still on to the 20th century, it's known to have very high poverty rates and very bad housing.
They were overcrowded in the homes. They had hole-in-the-wall beds with what they called hurley beds underneath. You would hurl the bed, that is, pull it out from under the bed to house the family. First up was best dressed and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of them couldn't afford proper fuel to heat themselves in the winter because of the vast unemployment and because of the failure of heavy industry, steel and coal and shipbuilding. And so in Glasgow, the Christian community rose to this, and there were a whole series of missions and specialist missions where you could go in to an evening meeting and have light and heat and comfort and encouragement.
In 1932, Jock was invited by the Glasgow United Evangelistic Association to become Deputy Superintendent of the Tent Hall. The Tent Hall was a mission hall which had been founded back in the time when D.L. Moody came to Glasgow.
D.L. Moody had preached in a huge tent or marquee in Glasgow Green. And when Moody saw the poverty in Glasgow, he said, "We must do something for these people." And they built the Tent Hall in Steel Street off the Salt Market. It was a kind of low-slung auditorium that took 2,400 people. And one of the features of the design that marked it out from any other place I've ever been in was the huge kitchens that were built because they wanted to feed the poor. And in those days, food was very important. Because in October 1932, there were hunger marches to London. And there was a crowd in Trafalgar Square of 15,000 in October 1932. The ugly face of depression was there.
The Tent Hall was known in Glasgow to be the flagship, in a way, of many similar places which were kind of mission preaching stations, not churches, but set up to be a place where people were invited in, often perhaps with some kind of music or magic lantern show, some kind of event, and then they'd hear a gospel message. The Tent Hall was known in Glasgow to be the largest venue, got the most number of people. It had a very strong community ethos, lots going on every night of the week. There's two sides to Glasgow. It's been a very wealthy city, and it's got a very great sense of civic pride, and these great missionary enterprises are part of that desire to make Glasgow known as the gospel city. That's its phrase. It's dubbed the gospel city because of the number of evangelistic enterprises.
Glasgow is the only city in the world, as far as I'm aware, which has a prayer for its motto. The prayer is, "Lord, let Glasgow flourish by the preaching of the word and the praising of your name." So he went to the Tent Hall as assistant to P.T. McCrosty, who was the book of his life story was called "The Man Who Walked Backwards," because he was always leading open-air marches from the front. By the summer of 1933, they invited Jock to be superintendent because P.T. McCrosty had gone home to be with the Lord.
Jock steps up to become the superintendent, so he's kind of the organising genius of the Tent Hall. In a sense, he's chief executive. There are so many elements going on.
There would be a multiplicity of meetings, that's a cert, within the building. But there was also a lot going out to the community. There was the feeding of the poor. And they had up to 1,500 people every Sunday morning for the free breakfast for the poor. They used to start queuing up at 5 o'clock in the morning round the building. In the afternoons, they would serve about 800 children in the Sabbath dinner for the poor children of Glasgow. There were the back court meetings, the open-air meetings, and so he preached in the open air at the shipyards. At lunchtime, the men were allowed to go to the gates at lunchtime, and he would have somebody playing a wee harmonium, and they would sing songs, and he would preach.
Well, we went into the harbour shipyard. All the men were there. A tough kind of men. Jock gave them the gospel, and they listened.
They used to have open-air meetings at Glasgow Cross. As a matter of fact, at one time they had 3 open-air meetings going simultaneously. One in Parney Street, one in Glasgow Cross, and I can't just recall where the other one was.
Glasgow Cross was a place people could congregate without being knocked down by a passing vehicle. And it could take about 300 people at that point.
If you were walking along Argyle Street while the open air was being held, you would hear Dad's voice away down the street, despite the fact that there were tram cars in those days.
He would stand at Glasgow Cross with the tram cars going by. Sometimes you couldn't hear the tram car for his voice. You must be born again. Christ died for our sins. He didn't try anything fancy. He just preached the gospel as it was.
He had a tremendous range of voice. He once burst a blood vessel in his throat, shouting so loudly in the open air.
And he chose people out of the crowd to illustrate his point, you know. Because in these great crowds, they're all kind, many drunkards, many communists at that time. It didn't deter him one bit. Nothing frightened him. He could preach for hours. People would still stay and listen to him.
When he was in Tent Hall, if he was coming down Salt Market, he would have about 20 children coming after him, all trying to get hold of him. So we, as family, had to stand aside and, you know, just let them go because the kids just loved him.
Rip-roaring prayer meeting every Friday night that went on till midnight with folk kneeling. You know, nowadays hardly anybody kneels to pray. It was a very vigorous type of prayer meeting that they had. They were like besieging the throne that God would come down in revival power again. And at Christmas, a glossy brochure with all the special speakers and musicians and all that sort of stuff packing the place over Christmas and the New Year, and a lot of handouts.
I mean, the numbers attending the Tent Hall are amazing. So I think it is, in a way, a beacon of light. It's a place where people can find some meaning, some kind of identity, some kind of respite from some of the harsh realities of life. It was a place where people went and experienced Christianity, experienced the church being open and welcoming.
Jock, he of course had a tie-up between the Bible Training Institute and the Tent Hall and Moody Bible Institute, because Moody was really the inspiration behind all that, and so he was invited over, and eventually he preached in huge halls both in America and Canada. He preached in the Moody Memorial Church in Chicago and big venues like that.
So the Tent Hall was part of a broader transatlantic network of evangelical revivalism.
My father and mother took me up to the Tent Hall to hear him. And I was amazed at the strength of his voice. It boomed out.
Well, I remember him as the superintendent of the Tent Hall in Glasgow. And I also remember him as a friend who regularly visited my grandfather, who lived with us during the closing years of his life. And one of the things that I recall was that when he had visited my grandfather, he always knelt down by the couch and prayed before he left the house.
He was the same at home as he was anywhere else. He just, you know, he was just a good guy. Maybe I'm prejudiced, but he really was. He had a good rapport with almost everybody. I never knew anybody that really fell out with him.
One of the aspects of my grandfather's leadership that I really appreciate was people that worked for him, really loved working for him. And I get a sense that each person that he came in contact with, he really loved and had a unique and genuine concern for.
There was a family in Glasgow called the Greens who had pioneered the cinema in Glasgow. They had bought a huge prefabricated building they used as a cinema, which was the biggest auditorium in Europe. And Jock suggested to the directors of the Tent Hall that they invite Harry Ironside and take Green's Playhouse for a month. And it was a tremendous success. They were getting 3,500, 4,000 a night at the Green's Playhouse meetings in September 1938. And the whole town, the whole city was heaving because of visitors to the Empire exhibition. And there were good results because Harry Ironside, he wrote a pile of books, and he was known as the boy preacher when he was a kid, and he knew how to preach.
The outbreak of the Second World War, 1939, Glasgow was a kind of hub, so there was lots of servicemen in and out of Glasgow, and Jock had a particular concern for them.
Immediately it happens, Jock's heart is full of a passion to reach these lonely soldiers and service people who are now using Glasgow as a transit camp, going to theatres of war all over the world. And his first job is to have service suppers. He had service suppers on a Saturday night that were absolutely crammed, big long tables full of service folk.
He had a twofold concern in the Second World War. One was a kind of correspondence ministry with those people who had gone out and been conscripted and gone to war, and maintained regular contact with those people via letter, sending them the tent hall information, and they would write back and share their prayer needs, their concerns.
Jock's personal letters attached to these bulletins created a living link with people who were in desperate danger.
And then he had a concern with the military personnel who were in Glasgow, and he helped establish something called the Moody and Sankey restrooms, named after D.O. Moody and I.O.D. Sankey, which was for military personnel who were in Glasgow. It was a kind of open house, just a set of rooms for them to occupy themselves during the day. One of the things that Jock realised was that when you're off duty, that military people would perhaps often go to the pub or get in other kinds of trouble, and he wanted to create a safe place for them, a place where they could find fellowship, could talk, where they could of course be put in contact with the gospel.
And many soldiers came to Christ because of that. Jock was very inventive in those days of restriction, understandably during the war, rationing and all that sort of thing. But Jock got over all that and was able to communicate in tangible ways with these men, and thank God many of them came to know Jesus Christ.
So he had a tremendous outreach. His daughter Rona gave me a brown envelope with letters in it written by service people expressing thanks from theatres of war all over the world. This was a leading aircraftman who was with the Air Force in Italy. A brother in the Lord who's now in North Africa wrote to me last week with very interesting news. He was sitting in a canteen abroad a few weeks ago, and on the table nearby he lifted a sheet of paper to find it was a weekly bulletin from the tent hall. And he said he nearly fell through his chair. He was not surprised to learn that the soldier sitting beside him was a child of the same wonderful Saviour we met in the tent hall. You know, stuff like that. My dear Jock, Christian greetings. This is a guy writing from the vital battles of the 14th Army. For some time now I've been responsible for organising the men for an evening service in town. The CO has been kind in giving us this privilege. Some Sundays I have a convoy of 3 transports for the service as we return to camp. It would do your heart good to hear the men on the transport singing, "He lives, turn your eyes upon Jesus, He is mine," etc. How frank my Christian friend and I feel. The Lord has placed us here, having been in the tent hall, to give the men the gospel. And the uncertainties of wartime life, these guys had a foundation, having come to hear the gospel in the tent hall.
Jock stepped down from the ministry at the Tent Hall in 1945. He was tired. He had spent a lot of energy, especially during the Second World War, with the military ministry.
He carried the burden of all these folk who were going abroad from being at the Tent Hall.
And I recall in particular that on the very last night of his superintendency of the Tent Hall, my father took me down to hear him, and he preached that night with great power, and I was very deeply moved. And I should have responded to the invitation, but didn't do so. And it was just a matter of weeks after that that I finally yielded my life to Christ.
And the then superintendent of the Tent Hall, Jimmy Haxon, invited me to come and be his assistant. I was there for 4.5 years, 47 to 51. And we had wonderful times there. And we preached the gospel and saw in 4.5 years, not one weekend without someone coming at the end and accepting Christ.
And after the war, he went to Canada. He was invited over by Canadian troops and all that kind of thing. And he went to America and he had huge meetings there.
He was in quite high demand. He was well known. He came into contact with the young Billy Graham in the 1940s, who was a relatively unknown at that stage, or making a name for himself anyway. And so Jock, I think, found that atmosphere in the United States congenial. There was a lot of people interested in doing the same kind of thing that he was interested in doing. That was an important aspect to his later ministry. Jock was preaching in Spokane in Washington State, and in 1954.
Yeah, it was Easter Sunday. He stood up and announced his text, "You must be born again." And within 3 minutes, he was in the presence of the Lord.
For someone who had committed his life so robustly to the preaching of the gospel, it seems particularly appropriate that God should bring a close to his life whilst preaching that very famous key text about being born again, which could really be the slogan of Jock's ministry. That was really the theme.
It's only been in recent years that certain individuals like George Mitchell, who wrote the book of my grandfather, have documented his life. And one of the things, even George's book called Revival Man, that name wasn't taken to hold him up as being a revival man. It was more meant to mean that he was someone who lived in revival mode all his life. And God used him in each chapter of his life in a revival mode. There's not a lot documented now about the last chapter after the Tent Hall. And it's really interesting that he had the opportunity to go to the United States as part of the Moody's Founders Conference when he was at the Tent Hall. And God used him mightily during that period, even in my hometown, Toronto, where he preached in the largest venue in the city, Massey Hall. And that caused people to be inviting him back. But after the Tent Hall, God used him again, and he was very involved with different evangelists and working as an extension worker with Moody Bible Institute, and continued preaching in various cities around the United States. And I still meet people from that period that will come up to me and say that they'd heard my grandfather preach, or they got saved in a meeting. So God continued to use him right up to the end, where, you know, as we know, he died preaching.
We might look back and say, well, you know, things like the Tent Hall are no longer in existence, and we might think that they are a product of a bygone age. The principle that embodies, and the principle that I think Jock embodied as someone who presided over that expression of non-institutional, non-hierarchical Christianity, is really still what the church is looking for. The church is still looking to be authentic, to be real, and to show that Jesus Christ is relevant and powerful and transformative for people where they're at. And I think that's probably the largest legacy. Not that we can simply copy the style and tone of what Jock Troup was, or what the Tent Hall was, or even what the 1920s revival was.
Well, I think Jock took the opportunities to speak. Very often we pray, Lord, give me opportunities to speak, but Jock actually took the opportunities. Quite often what I need is the courage to take the opportunities, and he did this in every direction. He preached for a verdict, he preached expecting results and responses, he preached expecting God to bless him because he had made himself available to God, and God used him.
When I come to this area and hear people talking about my grandfather and what happened, and hear the fondness and remembrances and yearning for something like that to happen again, that really stirs something up inside me, as it does with a lot of other people, that wouldn't it be great if God did something like that again? That said, in talking to some of the people that are older, that were really engaged in that kind of ministry, they recognized that the things that happened here and the way they happened were very contextualized to their time. And God will do something again through people who are yielded to him, but he'll do it in a way that's contextualized to this time. As the Psalm says, one generation will tell what God's done in the past generation. There's a purpose for that, so that young people and older people will recognize that God can do that in his own way today.
The Lamb, the bleeding Lamb, who died on Calvary. It is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul. It is the blood of Jesus Christ, his Son, which cleanseth us from all sin, in whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, according to the riches of his grace.